Well, welcome to Calvary Chapel, Memphis, and open your Bibles this morning to Esther chapter 7, titled that He will not leave you nor forsake you. And I know on the surface we can maybe think that God has forsaken us at times when we're going through struggles in our lives. And for this week's study, as I've done the last couple of weeks, I'm going to stick with the routine of sharing a psalm really that supports this chapter in the book of Esther today. It's a very short one, but it's one that is truly applicable. And I know that when King David wrote this psalm, you can see how he starts out in really an utter despair. He's discouraged, things are just looking so bad. But in these short verses, you can also see where he is relying upon and trusting in God. So the despair changes from, all of the gloom and doom to a place of trust and joy and encouragement. And that's where the way it is for you and I. We have these moments where everything is so heavy-hearted, where we're struggling with things in life in general. And that's usually kind of how we start with the Lord. We lay things out before God and we're struggling and we've got this heavy heart. And I know it doesn't happen all the time, but most of the time what happens is He lifts us up out of that, either through His Word or through just that time in prayer where we realize that, God, I know You're with me. So the 6 verses that I'm going to share are out of Psalm 13, and I'll read the first verse to you, where David wrote, "How long, O Lord, will You forget me forever? How long will You hide Your face from me?" Now, during a difficult time, we tend to think that God is not listening, that He's turned His back on us, that He's hiding His face from us and not paying attention to our needs. And from a true biblical reading and understanding of who God is, and just bear with me for this way of thinking is really flawed. It really is flawed to think that God is not listening or that He's turned His back on you. In many ways, really, it's disrespectful to God because we know that He is always there. And this is no way to put you down or me down for feeling like that, because we all go through our own personal pain and suffering. It's really just pointing out the fact that God never leaves us nor forsakes us, ever. And that's extremely important for us to realize. In the book of Esther, as we continue to go through it, Mordecai and Esther, they have, in fact, in their history, I'm not talking about the present day for Mordecai and Esther, but I'm talking about in their ancestral history, in their Jewish history, they have where God freed their people from slavery in Egypt. They know this. They were so well taught in the scriptures, passing it on to their young, and they certainly knew that. We know that Mordecai was very dedicated to God. So in their history, we know that God kept the people from being killed by Pharaoh. Because remember, if you will, the story, and if you can't remember the story, at least think of Charlton Heston here, as he's marching on with the people, and they get to the Red Sea. And this is biblical too. It's just Charlton Heston is just to help paint the picture if you need to see the 10 Commandments. But he's there with the people, and then all of a sudden, they're there, they can't move any further because of the Red Sea. And then they see Pharaoh's army approaching. So in between them and the Red Sea and the Pharaoh is nothing. There's no escape. They're dead as far as they could tell. And then God brings down fire to stop the chariots and all of the army of Pharaoh. And so they can't advance any further. But now they're just in between the fire and the Red Sea. They still can't do anything. And what does God do? Through Moses, He does a miracle. He parts the Red Sea. that they can walk through on dry land, and it's dry. Get that? He not only just took the water out, but what they had to walk on had to be dry. Otherwise, it'd be muddy and they'd be sinking and they'd be stuck there. So now they're walking, and I can tell you this, I'd be afraid just walking down in there, just looking up and seeing the water stacked up so high, and you're walking in the midst of all this. I mean, praise God that He's made a path, but this is a little weird. I'd be thinking that. I know they were too. But yet, God did part the Red Sea, and His people walked through it. God held the waters back. I know that there was great fear there. They were afraid of Pharaoh's army, and I believe they were obviously very afraid of what God could do to them, because God could have just allowed the water to fall upon them. Now they got across, and Pharaoh's army, the fire stopped, and they came in to the Red Sea, also on the dry land. But God let the water fall on them and wipe them out. My point is that we can see God working, and we can still have fear. They were seeing God working, and Mordecai and Esther, like I said, they were aware of this great event that happened for their people, how God rescued them from the hand of Pharaoh. So here is His people now facing another dilemma. And you and I, when we are struggling in life, it's like we're walking in between the walls of the Red Sea. We know that God is with us, but, we still wonder, God, are you going to allow the water to fall down upon me and crush me and wipe me out because I'm not worthy to receive your blessing? I know how that is. But yet we must understand that kind of tragedy is really reserved for the enemies of God, not for you nor for me, because God is very gracious and loving to us. King David goes on to say in verse 2 of Psalm 13, "How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long will my enemy be exalted over me?" And we get this mindset that God cares more for our enemies than He does for us. Why is that? Because we see how they're doing. They're doing so well. It seems like everything is okay, or they just don't care. Mordecai and Esther were seeing the enemy, and in this case, they were seeing Haman. In fact, Haman was being exalted and lifted up because of the king appointing him to a place of prominence. So here was this person that had been put in place, and he was upset because Mordecai didn't pay him honor and respect. But yet God was doing a work. As we read last week, things were changing. Haman had to lead Mordecai through the streets to honor him. And how humiliating that had to have been for Haman. Oh my goodness, Haman was going in there thinking, what is it that, the king is asking me, how should we honor someone of prominence? And he's thinking it's himself. So he says, what is it that I want? What is it that I want? So he comes up with this grandiose scheme, put the king's robe upon him that he's worn, put him on a horse that the king has ridden on, and have someone of prominence lead him through the city. And it happened to be Mordecai that Haman himself had to do that with. How humiliating. And this had to get carried out. By the way, this was the same day, the second day of the feast. Remember, there was Esther wanted to approach the king. She did. The king says, what is it that you want? I'll give it to you, up to half the kingdom. And she said, well, first, I want to have a party. And I think she did that because she didn't really know what to do. First, she was alive because the king extended the golden scepter, and she was able to survive. He didn't have her killed. Now, the only thing that, when you get back to this whole story of Haman, he was very proud because he was the only guest that was there on day one. He also was the only guest on day two. It's just that at the beginning of day 2, he got there a little early, and the king, oh, who's in the court? Oh, Haman, good, bring him in, bring him in. But he's got to take Mordecai through the streets. But remember that night before, to ease Haman's frustration, his wife suggested, and everybody around him, that he build a gallows where Mordecai could be publicly hung. So he was ready to hang him. He was ready to have Mordecai killed earlier than the last day of the 13th day of the 12th month. That was when the edict had gone out. But Mordecai was going to go down much earlier than that. I'm sure that Mordecai, when he's also being paraded around by Haman, didn't gloat. I don't think he did. I think he had that at heart of like, why am I doing this? I don't want to. He probably didn't want to. Remember, he was in sackcloth and ashes and praying for his people. But Mordecai had also gone to Esther to tell Esther that, you know, God has put you there for maybe such a time as this. And we talked about that. We have our own such a time as this moments, and they're not just a single moment. They're often many, many times that we're put in a place where God has you there for such a time as this. But also remember that Mordecai was quite direct with Esther, saying that, and if you don't do this, God will find another way. That was the faith and the trust that he had in God. And you could tell that that was implanted in his heart earlier in life. Through the scriptures, through the stories of like Moses leading the people out of Egypt. So he could be encouraged that God was going to help him. Going back to Psalm 13, David said in verse 3, "Consider and hear me, O Lord, enlighten my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest my enemies say I have prevailed against him. Let those who trouble me rejoice when I am moved." Lest those who trouble me. And I believe it's okay, like King David did here, to cry out to God and literally to just call out, you know, do this, Lord, for your name's sake. Do this because of who you are. And I'm sure Esther and Mordecai were thinking the same thing. Lord, you are the God of your people. You took us out of Egypt. And yet we have now come to this place where we're all going to be wiped out. It just can't be. So what do? Just like David, we trust God. Where he says in verse 5, "But I have trusted in your mercy. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." God has dealt bountifully with you. I know he has. And he has dealt bountifully with me as well. He always has. He always will. So here we are now, coming up on day 2 of the feast. And Esther is still, not quite sure, but it seems like as the day transpired from the day of the first feast to the second day, it seems like the Lord has put something in her heart to share with the king. She knew that she had to tell him that, look, you may not know this, but I'm Jewish. I'm one of those that Haman is going to kill. That's what she's about to share. So Esther chapter 7 verse 1, it says, "So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, 'What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done.'" So he says this a second time, willing to give her whatever it is, up to half the kingdom. But that's not what she wants. She knows what she wants. She wants to live, and she wants her people to live. Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king," and we know that she had. We know that she had found favor because he extended the scepter and she touched it, and she was able to come into the royal court where he was. And also because of the way she was selected. Because remember that she was chosen by the king not only for her beauty, but also for that inner beauty that the king saw in her. He said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request." She pleads for her life and for the lives of her people. And I know this was baffling to the king. Like, what are you talking about? You're my queen. I'm sure he was thinking, nothing's going to happen to you. What are you saying? The king had no idea that this was really all part of God's plan for his people. As she goes on for God's people, the king really didn't know what was going on at the moment, but she goes on to explain. "For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." So basically, she just lays it out. This is what's happening. I'm going to be killed. My people are going to be killed. And she makes a declaration. "Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." Esther is declaring that what Haman has devised means that she and all of her people would be killed. And the king, you can tell by his answer, he says, "The king answered and said to Queen Esther, 'Who is he, and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?'" Now you can see he's really oblivious to everything here. He's not catching on yet that this whole plot, this whole scheme, that he was set up to kill Mordecai and all of his people, because all of his people included Esther. So although the king is not quite understanding what Esther is referring to, he does ask, "Who has done this?" And Esther said, here's Haman sitting there like, where's she going with this? This is weird. And Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Now, you can tell the king is beside himself. I've got to share this with you because it's really funny. When you've got little kids, and same thing with our kids, but also with any kids that we meet, they watch you and they pay attention to what you do, and they mimic you all the time. And I have this one thing that I say to my grandson. I say, and I do a hand motion, but as soon as I say it, he does the hand motion. And what I say is, "I'm beside myself." As soon as I just say the words, "I'm beside myself," his hand goes up on his head. And I do that. I have fun with to me, it's an opportunity to just introduce bizarre behavior into the life of my grandson, and there's another grandchild on the way, and I will twist their little mind as well. But I did the same thing with my kids. My kids, I did things like that, and it's just hilarious. But I know that the king was beside himself, because it's like, well, how did this happen? Because what it says, the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. The king realizes now that he's been set up by Haman. He knows exactly what Esther is referring to now. This edict that you had me sign on to was to wipe out all the Jews. And there was this one Mordecai that you hated so much. But you didn't tell me that it also involved my queen. Now maybe he didn't know. That's what many scholars think, that he didn't know that she was Jewish. But the reality is this, she was, and Esther now is revealing it. And the king is very much aware that this guy Haman set all this up. And Esther, whom he loved, remember Vashti was disposed, the previous queen. Esther was brought in out of 400 women. She was selected, not only for her beauty, but because of her inward beauty. And the king cherished that. It wasn't like, well, that's the way it's got to be, I guess. He was infuriated. The king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. We have to realize that, I look at this thing also and I'm thinking, oh man, don't leave Haman alone with Queen Esther. Now I can imagine there were probably guards and people there in the area that she was probably okay, but the king was just so infuriated. It's like, what is this guy going to do anyway? He can't run, he can't get out of this. He needed to kind of get his head together. What is it that I'm going to do with this now? It said, when the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Now, on the surface, it doesn't seem like that bad of a thing. But just as Esther could not approach the king, no one could get close to the queen either that way. And so he had broken some serious protocol. And that's where the king comes in, and he sees this, that Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was, and the king said, "Will you also assault the queen while I'm in the house?" As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now what that means is they prepared him for death. Because whether you were hung or however you were killed, the one that was going to do the work, that was going to kill you, the executioner, it would cover your face. And that's what they did with Haman. They basically prepared him for death. It says all of Haman's pleading, just what one of the commentators wrote, he only got himself in deeper trouble. Now he was accused of personally assaulting Esther. And I love what they write here. It says, a Jewish writing says that the angel Gabriel pushed Haman so he fell on Esther's couch, just as King Ahasuerus was coming back into the room. Now that's a little over the top there, but you'd like to think, well, maybe that did happen. That would be fun, because we know that angels are all around us. And so here, one of the Jewish writers said that Gabriel pushed. I think of Clarence, like in It's a Wonderful Life, and jumping into the water or doing things like that. So Clarence, aka Gabriel, may have pushed Haman onto the couch. We don't know. Doesn't matter. He did. He did fall onto the couch. And with that, the king was even more enraged. It says in verse 9, now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him on it. Hung on the gallows that he had made. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath was subsided. Now it didn't solve the problem, because the king had written this into law. So there was another dilemma here still that we'll uncover and get into next week. But you can see that God was working in setting all of this up. Esther didn't really have a clue the first day, the first feast that she had, but on the second one, it seems like the Lord gave her some direction, helped her to know what is it that you need to present to the king. Here was Haman before her and the king, and she called out who did it, and it was this adversary and enemy, is this wicked Haman. That's who did it. And the king was enraged. I think also, as you and I are there walking through our own struggles, our own trials, and maybe we even get to that place where we're walking, God has parted the Red Sea for us, if you will, and we're still walking through that, and we're still a little nervous, a little concerned that, God, are you really going to get me through this? Are you really here with me? Because that's what David was asking. God, are you listening? Are you there for me? And I know Esther and Mordecai had to be thinking that. Now Mordecai, it seems like his faith was pretty strong in that he said, Esther, if you don't do this, God will do it another way. Why did he say that? Because he had seen God do things for his people. And I think that you and I need to always look back on those events. I love going back to the Old Testament and reading those stories because they're truth, for one thing. They're not fables, they're not made up stories. It is the true history of the people of God. And he took care of his people, even though they didn't deserve it. In fact, they deserved the walls crushing down on them. Later on, you'll hear that they're so rebellious, wandering through the desert, that God says, let me wipe them out, Moses. I'll start a new nation through you. These people were the seed of Abraham, the promise. God is saying, I'll start all over, and you'll be the one that my people will come through Moses. And Moses interceded on their behalf. Even to the point where Moses is about to pass away, we get down to the end of his story and his life. And remember, he misrepresented God, so he could only see Israel from the other side of the Jordan River. And when we were in Israel, that mountain was pointed out to us as we drove past it there in the Jordan Valley. So there on the other side of the river where the nation of Jordan is, that was where Moses got to peer into the promised land and see it, but didn't get to cross over into it. Even his whole life, the last 40 years of his life, had been spent getting the people ready to do that. Moses misrepresented God, and God said, you can't go into the promised land. So the final thing that Moses did is he gives the charge, a command to the people that God is there with you. And Joshua, who will now be taking over, is there on the scene, and he's hearing all of this from Moses. And in Deuteronomy 31:6, Moses is given the command to the people, which is a command for them and a command for you and me. Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear nor be afraid of them, for the Lord your God, he is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. A promise for that time then, a promise for Esther and Mordecai and the Jewish people, a promise for you and for me. He will not leave you nor forsake you. As we see how God got Esther and them through, we're not done yet with the story because the law is still there, but we'll get to that next week. But yet God is so ever faithful. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever will be. So whatever is going on in your life, whatever's going on in my life, we have to trust God. We have to be of good courage. We have to trust him, knowing that he will not leave you nor forsake you. And we know this verse is quoted many times throughout the scriptures. Why is that? Because it's such an encouraging verse. Deuteronomy 31:6. Remember that verse. Because God is there getting you through whatever you're going through. He hasn't left you. He hasn't forsaken you. He is always there with you and me. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your word. Just pray you just bless our day, our week ahead. And Lord, just help us with those struggles that we have when we doubt, when we are uncertain. And I just pray, dear Lord, that you would just use our very lives for your glory. Thank you, Lord, that you gave your Son for us, who died on the cross for our sins.